Give me just a moment here. I will be right with y'all. And there we go. Good evening. And now we just wait for our rest of our audience to show. Well, apparently I already have 3 viewers. Wow, that's pretty cool. Welcome and thank you. And if you're watching this later on YouTube, don't forget we have the whole like and subscribe thing down there. Anycubic photon magic miniature making machine. It extrudes forth a perfect miniature out of an enchanted potion. Yeah, that sort of thing. I'm waiting for people to kind of filter in and start filling up in the chat and that. I plan for this evening, I'm going to continue painting a figure I started earlier. Not on this show, but earlier. This is Farragut. Farragut is, as can be seen, a giant. I mean, I pick up my typical scale model, the Nordic warrior. And, yeah, he's big. He's real big. In 5th edition terms, he's only a hill giant. Yep. 5th edition hill giants are a lot bigger than they used to be. Why, do you ask? Because ogres and hill giants didn't have much difference in size. And that never really sat right. Especially when you consider that, your typical ogre only had like 4 hit dice. But your typical hill giant had like 9 or 10. Go figure, yeah. So, he's a hill giant. This is, in fact, to be exact, he is exactly the right height for a typical hill giant in 5th edition. Yes, his base does have kind of sandy, rocky area ground on it, and the reason for this is because, well, he's a Saracen. To be exact, he's a hill giant with 7 levels of fighter, with the Battlemaster path. Hello, Kim. Good evening. You might want to take some notes on what I'm going to be doing tonight, because I might accidentally create an entire game system tonight while I'm painting Farragut. Speaking of painting, something that y'all probably saw on the Discord or on Facebook. I'm going to show y'all how Roland came out. Roland, champion and paladin of Charlemagne. And Beowulf of the Geats, slayer of Grendel, slayer of the dragon, wielder of the sword Garm, or Graham rather. There's a better, more accurate picture in the Discord and on Facebook and on Reddit. Yeah. That's how they came out. Let me go ahead and put these back up on the top shelf. Well, not top shelf, but the giant shelf. Yeah. And then back into normal. Yep. See, what I'm going to be doing tonight, while I'm painting, I'm going to be discussing role-playing game design and wargame design. and I'm going to go in. I'm just going to discuss things. This basically is a way to, keep things a little bit interesting, so you're not simply staring at me going, all evening. So, and yes, I've actually designed war games and tabletop role-playing games in the past. I'm waiting for there to be just a few more people, actually speaking up and active in here before I get kicking onto the painting. I can discuss what I'm going to be doing to them. Basically, right now, let me go ahead and just use this as a pointer. As you can see, his face is done. And his face is done really nicely. His face came out really nicely. That is Farragut's face. He has a faint 5 o'clock shadow. He's got a slightly different tint to his forehead than he does to his lower face. Yeah, the face came out pretty nicely. But what I'm going to do, you always paint from the inside out. That doesn't mean paint their guts. That means skin is first. Then comes the innermost clothing layer, which on Farragut, there's 3 spots. Both elbows, because there's a tunic right here that goes under. So both elbows would be inside both the tunic and the gloves he wears. And then this knee. The other knee is covered by his tunic. After I get those done, then it would be the lower boots and then upper boots, the gloves. Then I would do the tunic, then a combination of the mail and the scale, and then the trim on these bits, and then the sash. I can probably do the headpiece simultaneously with the knees. So that's and of course the sword. One thing about it is it's going to be easier to tell on the sword what I did than it is on Beowulf. Beowulf, it's kind of hard to see. And what that is once again, I'm going to use the brush to point. The bottom half. I painted the whole thing this almost black metal and left it there in the fuller. I then painted it a thin layer of steel over the whole thing, and then as I got to brighter layers, I painted it over less and less until finally there was just a little bit here of silver. On the top side, I did the opposite, so that there's a tiny little layer here of silver. I then used this really, really almost white pearl, pale metal, to paint the edges of both the blade and the edges of the fuller. And yes, it's a fuller, not a blood groove. The groove down the middle, or down the middle of a symmetrical sword, or down the back of this sword, exists to lighten the blade and make it stronger, not to cause blood to go. Anyway. Yes, I did that. I really did that. Slide this a little bit more over here, so it's, when I glance down at the screen to read the chat, I'm not looking all the way over here. Okay. Now, get some soda, and if we don't really get more people active in the speaky typey thing, I'm probably just going to go ahead and just get started, because I really do need to. Okay. While we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and get started about the discussion topic. Okay, designing a game system. By this, I don't mean designing an add-on for a game system, like a campaign setting for D&D, or a new army list for your homebrew, version of Warhammer 40k, where you've got the McDonald's Marines. I mean designing from scratch. Coincidentally, this first portion will also refer to how to pick a system for a campaign you want to run, if you've got a specific story and a specific genre you want to tell. So meanwhile, let me go ahead and shift down to here. And here we have sleeping monster. He's your little baby girl. Yeah, sweetie. Okay, there we go. And here we have our critter. Okay. Now the reason I've got this light on up here is because there's really not enough light coming from this for me to really get a good view on what I'm doing. Okay, so what I'm going to do first... Well, I forgot to grab these. As I've said before, this is distilled water and vegetable glycerin that I use to thin down washes and that. And this is matte medium, used to make it a little bit more translucent and thin it down a little bit, but more importantly, it makes it more of a glaze and less of a paint. Now, what I need to do is decide on the color. Now, I know that the tunic is going to be red. The boots and gloves are going to be dark leather. So I need something that's not going to be overwhelmed by either one of them. So I'm thinking I'm going to do kind of a grayish brown. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to mix colors. So I got myself fur brown, and uniform gray. And we're going to see what we can do. Now, since this will cover more space than the typical sleeves of a regular miniature, make sure to shake these up. We're going to use a little bit more paint on both than would normally be used. So we're going to use 2 drops of each. No, let's make it 1 drop of each. 1.5, yeah. Advantage of a dropper bottle is you can actually do half drops. So I'm going to put it over here. 1 drop. Then I'm going to start the squeeze and just kind of pull it off. And this gray, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to give it 1 drop. And I'm going to start a drop, kind of pull it off. By touching the started drop to the paint that's already down there, you can pull off less than the full drop. Okay? Now, always thin it down at least a little bit. In my case, that means putting a tiny little drop of matte medium. 1 drop for these 3 should be more than enough. And then the problem with the dropper I have for this is that it's leaking from somewhere, so I get large drops. I'm just gonna 1 drop. That's all I really need for this, because we're not trying to do a wash. Now, yeah, this should do it. Gonna mix it up. And as we look at it, we can see it's still a little brown. It's not quite gray enough for what I'm looking for. It's still too saturated. So we're going to add a little bit more. Another full drop of the uniform gray. We want it to be more of a dark taupe. than anything. If you're familiar with that particular color name. It's a word that my brother hates. So if you're watching, Danny, haha. Okay. There we go. And I'm going to paint where this would be. And yes, painting it directly on the figure, it becomes much more obvious. It's a really nice dark gray, or dark brownish gray. Now, the one big advantage to painting from the inside out is that, number one, when you're starting out, you don't have to worry about things like, you know, did I just splatter that wash or whatever over top of the other color that I just spent a couple hours working on. One thing to note is that because we can give these figures some remarkable poses straight out of the gate without having to worry about some aspects of molding, this does mean that there will be places that will be a little bit more difficult to reach than on a more typical figure. Okay. Now, because this is thin down, it will have some issues on occasion with it won't completely cover. That's fine. We don't care, because if it doesn't completely cover, we can always come back in with another coat. In fact, most of these are best done with at least 2 coats. If it's thick enough and opaque enough that you can go over it with 1 coat, thin it down a little bit more, because 2 thin coats are always better than 1 thick. And even if it's an exceptionally pigment-dense paint, that just means you have even more room to thin it down and give it even tinier and even less effect on the details of your model. Now you'll notice I have, right when I get close to the edges, I put my fingers up against the model itself, against the base. That's because it's a handle, nice. I mean, if you look at my hands right here. Hello, Mark. I mean, I've got my thumbs and fingers bracing my hand. I have it on just a quick little shape that I printed. Okay, and now we're going down here. Now, getting on to the other subject of the night besides painting this giant, and that's game design. If you're designing a game just to design a game, stop. You won't get anything worth it. There's usually 2 reasons to design a game. Okay? One is you have a world or story or genre you want to explore, just like a writer. Or you have an idea that you think would be enjoyable for other people. The second reason is, well, you got contracted out to write the game system for a property. So, those are your 2 primary ways, or reasons, to be creating your own game system. Now, a lot of that went away with the release of the Open Gaming License, but not all of it. You see, the thing about the Open Gaming License in D20, the D20 system doesn't fit all genres. But even if we ignore that little tidbit of information and we decide to go ahead and create our own game system, there's some things we have to consider. The first and most important thing is, what is the primary focus of the rules? Not the story, the rules. Do you have an inordinate amount of game rules for character interaction, with only a couple rules here and there on fighting? Do you have a large number of rules about the legal system of this world, which is a rather odd choice in my opinion? Or how politics can affect character interaction? Okay, fine. Are you focused mainly on the magic of the world for a game like Ars Magica? Or are you focused on all the fancy techniques and martial arts skills for a campaign that's based around mythic China or that sort of thing? Okay, so you've got your concept, you got your the genre you want, you've got your basic setting. The next thing you have to decide, do you want it to be cinematic or simulation? And by that I mean, a cinematic game isn't really that realistic. They tend to be fast, not always, but they tend to be fast. And they tend to more accurately simulate what you see on the big screen rather than what you see in person in real life. A simulationist game is the opposite. It tends to be more of what you see in, action movies and, kung fu movies rather than what you see in person. In case you're wondering, I'm getting out the mixes I'll be needing for later layers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to give it a second layer that's a little bit lighter and give it a bit of a dry brushing. Then I'm going to give it a wash, and then I'm going to paint on the highlights. Now, a good example of a simulationist game, one that tries to be as accurate as possible to its source material, or accurate as possible to reality, is a game called Twilight 2000. It was late 80s, early 90s, I think, is when it came out. And it was set in a now defunct future World War III in Europe. And it was based almost entirely around military action. Now, the end result was you had a game that, well, it was very realistic for, what happens if a bullet hits you in that spot on the body. But it was a little rough when it came to, well, what happens when you try to negotiate with local villagers? Or, it also was a little bit rough on it's taking 5 hours to run one round of combat with 4 players and 2 enemies. And a good example of a cinematic system would be, it was a game from the late 90s, early 2000s, recently had a second edition come out called 7th Sea. One of the things it did that was beautiful is it had what were called mooks. And by that it means thug type characters. For example, you have your heroes, and they end up running into a group of thugs run by the bad guy of the adventure. Well, what differentiates them from higher ranking bad guys or even the player characters, they can't take any damage. Literally. They take 1 point of damage, they're down. It's like the mooks in your typical action movie, where you see the hero plowing through dozens of bad guys and knocking them all down as he goes. And that's what it represented. Especially the more swashbuckler action movies, like the ones with Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone. Well, then after you beat the mooks, you face the lieutenant. Now, 7C used a health level system. Everyone had a certain number of health levels. You took fewer if you managed to make an endurance roll when you got hit than you would have if you failed that roll. So your lieutenants had roughly half as many health levels as the player characters. So you could fight them for a while and get a couple good shots in, and then you'd get them good and they'd go down. And the big bads and the boss fights, bosses had as many health levels as the heroes, sometimes more, depending on the boss. But by separating the bad guys into mooks, lieutenants, and bosses, it really nicely simulated how an action movie works. You've got the big, the brute squad that does nothing but, show up. Oh no, the bad guys' troops are here. Let's plow through them. And then you've got the lieutenant, who's a credible threat, but still gets taken out. And then finally the big bad, where fighting him is the climax of the campaign, or the movie. So we then go over, we compare those two games. They have one further difference, and that's complexity. You can have a very, very simple simulation game and a very, very complex cinematic game. Although normally, the more simulation-y you are, the longer it takes to run, and the more rules there are, and the more complex it is. So, we have ourselves the decision to make. Do we want to be simulationist, or do we want to be cinematic? And then we have, do we want to be complex or simple? One of the most complex games I have ever played. Some of you may have heard of it. It was called Rollmaster. Also nicknamed Rule Master or Chart Master. It was so bad that every single attack spell, every single weapon, all of it had its own chart for rolling damage. I don't mean like just a chart, I mean a full page chart. And the end result was, if you swung a sword at someone and you hit and you determined your damage, you might do damage, you might end up doing a critical effect that would actually have some interesting side things. For example, one of the criticals for the crush table, which was used by things like, the critical tables were separate from the weapon tables, by the way. Crush was used by heavy bludgeoning attacks. One of the critical results was, opponent's pelvis shatters. They die after 30 rounds of intense pain. 30 rounds of intense pain. Yeah, that's nice. So yeah, it can be a bit much. They were close to it was close to a simulation, this game, but it had the problem that it was also trying to simulate a fantasy, but at the same time trying to be realistic about simulating fantasy, and that never goes well. For most high fantasy, you really want to stick to more of a rather than you want to be more of a cinematic for high fantasy, simply because when you've got fireballs flying around, you know, trying to be realistic about them just kind of makes them less fun. Then you have, after that, you got an example of an extremely simple game. Well, there's always twerps. Twerps stands for the world's easiest role-playing system. Basically what it was, you had one stat. Everyone had one stat. And it was effectively your character level for all intents and purposes. Okay, that was the wash on that. We gotta let it dry for just a few. Well, that depends. I mean, there does come a point like D&D's infamous fighter who would rather jump off a 500-foot cliff than take the fire breath, not because one death is preferable to the other, but because he knows he can easily take the damage from the fall, get up, and run away. What? Or, man, they're firing 16-inch cannons at us. Oh, damn, I can only take about 5 or 6 hits from that before I go down. What? Anyway, but twerps, what you did was you simply said, okay, I'm playing a cat burglar. My rank is 1. Okay. And if you want to do something, and the game master decided that it was within the purview of cat burglar, you could do it with your full skill. If it wasn't, you couldn't. Well, yeah, but when you do things like that, you may as well be playing Marvel heroes or DC heroes. Which brings up a point. Marvel heroes and DC heroes were both cinematic systems. Very cinematic, because they were trying to simulate comic books, not reality. But DC Heroes was a much more complex system than Marvel. Marvel, you could literally throw up a party within the first half hour, play an entire one-shot in just a couple hours. You had the problem, however, that you might end up with one character that's as powerful as Thor, and his teammate who's as powerful as Aunt May. Anyway, while we're waiting on this to dry, I'm going to do one other thing. Around the helmet here, the little cloth hanging down and the cloth wrap around the helmet, we're going to go ahead and take care of those. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paint them first with the skeleton bone, and then mummy robes, and then white. Because it's going to be an off-white. Before I paint it with the skeleton and the mummy robes and the off-white, though, I'm going to give it a very faint hint of a red. Now that's 1 drop. That's all I'll need. Let me go ahead. I'm going to check one thing. Yeah. Playing with the focus on the smartphone. And then we're going to give it just a little bit of this. We don't really need to thin it so much as just... Okay. Now. It will probably take me 2 coats to paint this skeleton bone on the veil and I'm not sure what you'd call that, the wrap around the base of the helmet. Whatever it would be called. Yeah, it's looking like it's going to be 2 coats. Okay. It's a good idea to always have your hands braced against each other or against the model as often as you can. And if it's on the model, it's going to be on someplace that does not affect paint job immediately. For example, for right now, the base isn't going to be painted for a while. That'll come after I do everything else. So I can rest my hands on the base and not worry too much. And anyway, getting back to the game design. So you've got simple games and you've got complex games. You've got simulation and you've got cinematic. Now, while certain, applications thereof tend to be better for certain genres, like cinematic for high fantasy or superhero, which could theoretically be considered to be modern high fantasy, and simulationist for military action. Really and truly, it's up to you. Normally, if you're just doing it your story, you already know what kind of story you want to tell. High adventure like Conan for cinematic storytelling, or grim and gritty high-tech lowlives for more simulationist. You want to know what that 45 caliber bullet just did to the bad guy's spleen. But if you don't, just, take a step back. In the genre you're working in, do you more often see kind of more realistic style movies, or more dynamic, holy cow, that stunt was remarkable style movies? And I should help you place it. The pacing. Does the pacing tend to be slow and, in the movies that is, and rather stolid? For example, a more historical spy thriller would tend to be a slow-paced, slow burn, high stress scenario, as opposed to the James Bond school of spies, which is dancing around in high-speed combat, chasing vehicles, seducing the bad guys' henchmen, So, choose between the styles to fit your genre. Now, you got those. Where do you go from there? Well, first things first is you need stats. There's pretty much there's only a tiny handful of games that don't have stats. And most of those are either twerps, or they're, well, I hate to put it this way, they're gimmick games. Games that they sell themselves on the fact that they're doing things differently from everybody else. Look at us, we're different, and most of them tend to fail. So you need to figure out what stats would fit how you want this game to run. And also what the range is for those stats. Let's look at a couple. We're not going to look at D&D. We're going to look at one I mentioned earlier, Marvel Heroes tabletop role-playing game from the 1980s. What they did was they determined that the stats would be things that everyone had, things that everyone could do, but that still had a nice variety of range. So, crazy cat. So what they did was they had everyone has some skill in fighting. In fact, some characters, that's one of their claims to fame, like Captain America and Wolverine. Everyone has some level of agility, whether it's really high up there like Spidey, or as clumsy and brutish as Rhino. So, obviously those are two. Everyone has some measure of strength. Aunt may not have very much, but she has enough to, to pick up a roasting pan at the very least. Everyone's got endurance, whether it's how well they can take a beating, like the Punisher, or just simply they don't get tired and it takes a long time, like the Thing. Well, that's good enough for the physical stats for them. So then, okay, what about the mind? Okay, everyone, you got intelligence, because, you got, Spidey's really smart, and Iron Man, and Mr. Fantastic, and the Hulk certainly ain't, but he's still got some. Okay. We got a lot of characters in Marvel that have a lot of superhuman senses, like Wolverine, and Daredevil, and Spider-Man. And then you've got characters that wouldn't notice a 10-ton whale dropping out of the sky in front of them, like Foggy Nelson, or at least that's how he used to be. He got a lot better about noticing things when they left the Silver Age. So, what do we do? Well, I'm going back up to here. I need to drop in a little bit more medium. So perception, and then finally, intuition. And finally, we need something to represent how some people can break free of mind control easily, while others seem to fall for it every other week. And then some people have just this incredible strong will, like the Master of Magic, Doctor Strange, while others, well, don't, like how Iron Man kept falling back into the bottle in the comic version. So, psyche, your willpower. Those are their stats: fighting, agility, strength, endurance, reason, intuition, and psyche. Now they needed a range, and here they flubbed up. Most games, like D&D or the Palladium system, a 16 strength is as much stronger than an average man as a 16 intelligence is smarter than an average man. Right? Makes sense. Well, they need to simulate a wide range of physical abilities, but not as wide a range of mental ones. Reed Richards was technically peak human intelligence, not superhuman. Same thing with Dr. Doom. They weren't superhumanly smart. They were peak humanly smart. So what they did was the human range for intelligence was a lot wider than the human range for strength. Now, everyone starts the same. Typical. A 6 out of 100. The average human being has a typical in everything. Alright? You with me? So, you got your typical strength, typical agility, typical reason, all of it. So what they then did was they decided, okay, fighting we've got a lot more room to work with because there's a lot more variance in skill, and there's not many people with a superhuman skill in fighting. Those that are, we can put them at the 75 or 100 rank. So Captain America, who is our benchmark for peak human in the Marvel Comics universe, in the movie verse he is mildly superhuman in everything. He's got a fighting skill of amazing, which is 50 out of 100. And this means that anyone else who is as good as it's possible to be in combat skill, which includes, of all people, Black Panther and the Punisher, which I disagreed with that ranking for him. He's good, but he's not Captain America good. Batman could be said to probably have that same level of fighting skill. Anyone who has less has a lower rank. And here's why I say the Punisher does not have that same rank. Wolverine has one rank lower than Captain America in combat skill. So does Iron Fist. And I'm sorry. No, Wolverine is not less skilled in combat than Punisher. That's just a no. Anyway. They have a few people with superhuman agility, however, like Spider-Man and, officially, Nightcrawler. And this is before Gambit became popular. In fact, before Gambit was a character. So, we give them a little bit more room. We have Spider-Man be the amazing rank of agility. And Captain America has incredible, one rank lower. Come on, Shinju. You're just staring at the table, aren't you? Come on. Come on, baby girl. I don't want you walking through the camera again. And I mean through, not in front of. Anyway. I'm going to let this dry for a few. We've got the ivory drying and the taupe drying. And so on and so forth. They went through and you ended up with your peak human stats doing that. D&D, peak human stats are all 20s. Average is 10, maximum is 20. Hey, done. Hey, that's what you gonna do. Yay. Okay, sweetie kit. Okay, sweetie kit, come on. Come on, step out. Yeah, there you go. Good girl. You're my baby girl. Yeah. Okay. Anyway. Now, we cut over to another game, Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade, every average human had a 1 in everything. Every average vampire had a 2 in everything. Peak human had a 4 in everything. Peak starting vampire had a 5, unless you were a really high generation and you had other bonuses and stuff. Anyway. So, it didn't matter if it was, interpersonal charisma type skills or fencing. Everyone had the same maximum human stats for everything. Now, the easiest way to come up with what stats you need is you start with the absolute minimum needed for just a very basic role-playing game. Let's say that for stats, if your combat skill is going to be based on a character level style, then we don't need to include that as a stat. For example, D&D. But what D&D needs, okay, we gotta have something to represent how physically strong they are. Whether it's for carrying equipment or hitting really hard in melee. We then need to have something to represent how nimble and swift they are, how quick their reflexes are. And with that, we get dexterity. And then how tough are they? We get our constitution. How smart are they? Intelligence. How well can they deal with other people? Charisma. That's bare minimum. Wisdom exists for another game design purpose, and that's once you've got your bare minimums, what do you need to simulate the genre and the playstyle you're looking at? And that's where D&D picks up wisdom. Because you needed wisdom to represent how well you interacted with the divine. Yes, later on, when you started getting skills, or non-weapon proficiencies as they were called back then we started seeing a more use for wisdom if you're not a cleric. But in 1st and 2nd edition, if you weren't a cleric, there was very little use for wisdom whatsoever. Even your saving throws were based on your class and level, not on your stats. So, what they did, wisdom existed for clerics, pretty much, almost entirely. Some people would use them for role-playing purposes. My character's got a really low wisdom, so he's a bit of a goofball. He may be smart, but he's kind of common sense dumb. And you started seeing a split in how people perceived wisdom because of that. Because it really didn't have a clear-cut purpose for anyone who wasn't a priest. Oh, sorry, a cleric. When they came around to redesign the newer editions, when 3rd edition came around, they decided they needed to give each stat a purpose. What did they serve besides being, you need dex to be a thief, you need strength to be a fighter, you need intelligence to be a wizard. I said, well, okay, by simplifying all of the saving throws from save versus spell, save versus poison, save versus petrification. Yes, there was a save versus petrification that was its own separate saving throw. Instead of all that, they decided, okay, well, what if we make things that are resistible by being tough, which is it was called a fortitude save. Things that were saved against by being strong-willed, which was your will save. And things that are saved against by getting the heck out of the way, which was your reflex save. And this gave wisdom a function beyond just being needed for priests, and that function was willpower. How strong-willed were you? So now the fighter with the really low wisdom, oops, he's now vulnerable to mind control type spells or charms, effects that affect his brain. Psionics really did a number on that low wisdom fighter. What was that? Mind Flayer? Oh, heck no! And the end result was it balanced out the stats a bit more than they had been. Now, we were trying to figure out what are the absolute minimum stats needed for the genre we're playing. Once you get your absolute minimums, you need to fill them out with stats needed for your, for how you want to play it. So D&D already had the stat, but it didn't have a purpose. It was misused. they ended up going in and properly using it. Okay, Kim, bye-bye. Now, another way to look at it is tabletop wargame. When it comes to, your most basic level, tabletop role games and tabletop role-playing games and tabletop war games only differ by degrees. Your typical tabletop war game that's out now kind of follows the school of Warhammer. I don't like to put it like that, but it's basically what it does. You've got your attack skill, attack strength, defensive strength, wounds, armor, morale, and movement. And sometimes your attack skill is split up by melee and ranged. Everything from War Machine to Warhammer to Vor, they all use that basic style. On the other hand, if we go back to let's go to second edition AD&D, and the second edition AD&D battle system. The first edition battle system was horrible, utterly horrendous. It basically took almost as long to do a single round of combat between 10 troops in battle system first edition as it did in the actual tabletop game in first edition. So when they went to second edition, they decided, okay, strip everything away. What do we need? What do we need? And so they sat and looked, and they said, okay, the first thing we need something to show how hard something hits. We need to show how well something can take a hit, how long they can keep fighting, how fast are they, and how brave are they. And so they came up with the idea of attack dice. Every troop type, creature, and entity had a certain number or a certain size of attack dice. For example, a halfling with a dagger, a first level halfling with a dagger, had an attack die of D4. Whereas a troll had an attack die of D12. And they had a chart. When you rolled a die, if you rolled a 1 or 2, there was 0 wounds inflicted on the enemy unit. If you rolled 1 through 3. If you rolled a 4 or 5, you did 1 wound. If you did 6, you did 6, 7, 8, or 9, you did 2. And so on and so forth. With the strongest critters doing, for example, D12 plus D12, which didn't mean they rolled 2D12 and added them, it meant that they rolled D12 twice per figure. And the end result was then, that's how many wounds they did, so they could theoretically do up to 8 wounds. What is it, 9? Or 10 rather. Either 8 or 10. Anyway. But what ended up happening was, once you've done that, then the person you just hit makes his armor save. Now, armor went from 1 to 10. And under normal circumstances, it was always a straight-up save. There were a few circumstances that would reduce it or ignore it. But an unarmored human had an armor save of 10. The Tarrasque had an armor save of 2. You rolled equal or higher than your armor. Okay. Then you had movement speed, morale, and wounds. Wounds being how many it took how many wounds your unit would have to take one figure off the board, just like in Warhammer and other games like that. So they stripped it as far down as they could go, which would make it great for mass battle systems. And then they did this cardinal sin and never supported it. They had a pretty decent mass battle system, and they never supported it with scenarios, other than the scenario that came in the book. They never supported it with, army tier miniatures. They had, you could still go out and buy your bugbears and your player characters, but they didn't pull a full Games Workshop and actually make armies that you could collect. They just said, okay, that's good enough. Yeah, we're good. So they flubbed it there hard. Of course, they also filled the book with some pretty mediocre painted figures. Anyway. Okay, so you got your stats. Next comes skills. A simulationist game will probably have a lot of different skills. Because you need to know, is your florist really good at anything related to plants, or only with arranging plants to look pleasing to the eye? Can they tell if a given type of flower is poisonous, or do they only know that it means friendship in the language of flowers? Whereas with a cinematic, well, let's just look at Dr. Bruce Banner. Dr. Bruce Banner, his doctorate's in physics, specifically high energy radiation. And yes, gamma rays are a thing. It's just it's a wide frequency of the spectrum. And they are ionizing radiation that do cause damage to DNA. They just don't turn you 10 foot tall and green. Okay, we're still waiting on the elbows to dry a little bit, because that was a pretty... When you add the medium to paint, it takes longer to dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint this part of the helmet. Anyway, apparently Dr. Bruce Banner, who is a trained high-energy physicist, can also perform without question as a doctor in a small, out-of-the-way third world village. He also knows enough to identify, it's just ridiculous how much these people know when it comes to every form of science. Reed Richards is also a physicist, in his case focusing on n-dimensional physics, especially as it equates to, well, in modern terms, superstring and potential, space-time calculations. And yet he's also a master of chemistry, an engineer who can build the devices that his theories develop, and an electrician who can, properly set up the circuits inside that device, and so on and so forth. So yeah, in a cinematic game, your scientist is generic omnidisciplinary scientist. So your skills either overlap a lot or are just in general vague. An example of far too many skills, we're going back to Rollmaster. Rollmaster had a skill list that was literally... Oh, what is this, Robert? This is Farragut. He's a hill giant with no less than 7 levels of fighter, with the Battle Master path, meaning he's got techniques. And he's the arch enemy. Oh, come on, don't do this. There we go. Of Roland the Paladin. Paladin of... let me bring him in here and... Roland the Paladin. Paladin of Charlemagne. Anyway, so like I was saying, Rollmaster had a very big problem with way too many skills. Oh, he's not big. You want big. Say hello to Argus. Argus Panoptes, herdsman of Hera. He is roughly the size of a storm giant in 5th edition. That's big. Yes, Mark. He is hill giant. Move him kind of in the middle, just to make sure I get it focused. Okay. Anyway, we're also discussing game design. Now, Rollmaster had far too many skills. And it was entirely possible for you to have 100% skill with an epee and 0 skill with a small sword, which is only marginally different from each other. There was no crossover of skills, which was ridiculous in many cases. Okay, it's looking like it's almost dry in the crooks in the elbow. We can go ahead and start moving on to the next level, which is the tunic. So, I'm actually going to, before I paint on red, this is an exceptionally opaque orange. It's made by Vallejo in their game color line, or their game extra opaque line, actually. So shake it up, shake it up, shake it up. Now, as I said, you go from inside out when painting. His skin's already done. I just did his innermost tunic and innermost trouser. So now, I'm getting ready to paint. Get an appropriate size brush. Getting ready to paint his outer tunic, which is right here. And like I said, when you're painting it, you can go ahead and get away with, kind of on the earlier inner layers, you can get away with almost overlapping. So you use this point to go ahead and make sure that you go all the way up to anything that overlaps on top of it, so that you don't end up with any gaps left behind. Now they say it's an opaque orange, it's actually more of a salmon color. Okay. And we're gonna make sure to come under here. Once I have this on and it's dry, which down here will probably be dry by the time I finish the sleeves, then we'll be going to red. And in the case of this guy, it's going to be really nicely rich red. Now the reason we're going with red on him not only is because he's a Saracen, but also because when I painted Roland, I painted most of his trim, most of his cloak and his trim and that blue. So Roland's color is blue. Therefore, being his arch enemy, Farragut's color is red. Now, it is nearly impossible for me to reach all the way in between underneath the legs. I really should have painted it before I put it on the base. But that's beside the point. That's neither here nor now. Here nor there. But since it's primed this medium dark gray, that's fine because it's a shadow underneath them. And I just realized I should not have done the tunic yet. Instead, I should have done the boots next. That's fine. I'll go ahead and put this coat on, and while it's drying, I'll paint the boots. Then come back in and touch up contact points with the salmon and paint the rest of it. Okay. One thing I really like about these dropper bottles that, see, when I was painting before, dropper bottles weren't a thing. And that's, you never use more than you need with these dropper bottles. Unless you just be like those people from Privateer Press and squirt half a daggone bottle out onto your palette. Alright. Now, getting back to game design. Skills are something that are still relatively new in Dungeons and Dragons. They didn't exist as we know them in first edition. They were class-based. The only class with any kind of actual skill listings was the thief. And it was, they all had the same, well, they had the same skills, but they had percentage points they could shuffle. They were actually the most versatile of the character classes back then. You could put more points into picking locks, or more points into picking pockets, or climbing, or stealth. That sort of thing. So, what would often happen is, if someone wanted to be, say, a blacksmith, well, first of all, actual role-playing back then was kind of rare. People tended to just hack and slash, play it like a board game with more detail. You know, the old cliche, explore dungeons to get treasure, to get better items, to explore more dangerous dungeons, to get more treasure, etc. Anyway, so in second edition, they came up with the idea of, everyone had weapon proficiencies, and fighters got the most. No, fighters did not automatically start off knowing how to use every weapon. In fact, that was considered overpowered for a while. For one of the character options in second edition, you functioned as if you had proficiency, even if you didn't, with anything except the most exotic weapons, in one of the options that you could take for your fighter. That was seen as overpowered. But they added in non-weapon proficiencies. And at first you had to give up a weapon proficiency to take them. And then later they made their own pool. So by the time second edition or third edition comes out, all of a sudden we actually have skills. The thing is, by that point, skills were not a new thing. Most other games had skills. Most other games had rules for your stats increasing as you go up in level. It took the third edition for that entire concept to come about in D&D. Stat improvement through character growth, and not through finding a magic book that tells you how to exercise. And it takes magic for exercise to work. Yeah, that was a kind of ridiculous bit. Yes, I'm painting the figures that I sculpted. If you saw my post today on Facebook, yeah, I started them on Tuesday here on broadcast. Okay, so I have this opaque salmon on his tunic. I can go ahead and say, okay, what I really needed to have done is the boots. Then done that because the tunic overlaps the boots. So what we're going to do, we're going to decide on the color for the boots. Let's see. We've got that taupe for the knees and elbows. And it's going to be bright red for the tunic when I get the full red shade on it. So we need something that's going to be a little bit darker than that taupe. Alright, this oak brown. Alright, once again, this is going to be a little bit more than a usual figure, so I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. 3 drops of paint. That's a bit more than I normally do. This is matte medium. It's roughly equivalent to Laman medium by Games Workshop, but a whole boatload cheaper. Now, mix it up, because that'll help it flow a bit better. And we're going to paint it on the boots. What we end up with is a slightly richer brown than what the pants had. Okay, I go up here. Make sure that I cut all the way up to the seam. Okay. And down here. Now, when I was creating the game stats for these guys, and yes, I have game stats for them, D&D 5th edition stats, I started with the closest giant type to what they were. Determined were they more or less powerful, and if so, how much so. Now here's the secret. Argus Panoptes up there is closest in power to a storm giant. One of the other figures that I do not have yet sculpted or printed, who would pretty much end up being a stretch goal, ended up as an Empyrean, aka a Titan. Yes, there is a Titan that is a stretch goal. Titan of the Sea. Okeanos. Now, again, I kind of fudged the actual stats on some of these. He is an Empyrean. He is not a god. Even though, mythologically speaking, Titans were gods. It just they were a different manifestation, I guess you could say, from their cousins and or nephews and nieces and or children, the Olympian gods. They tend to be more primordial and less conscious of morality, I guess you could say. Not that the Greek gods were very moral to begin with. Okay, so we have... always give it a double check. Make sure you didn't miss anything. Always. Now, right down here. We've got a problem. There we go. Alright. Well, I started, like I said, with let's use Farragut here. Farragut in the story Horn of Roland, which is almost 1,000 years old story. He was a Saracen descended from Goliath. He was a giant who was a commander in the Saracen army. Now, he was large enough that he was, terrifying people, but not so large that he wasn't, that Roland wasn't a viable fighter. Actually fighting it out 1-to-1 melee. And Roland's skill kept Farragut from causing significant harm, and Farragut his skin had been treated by alchemists to make it turn away any weapon. So they would fight for, they fought for most of 2 days. And then at night, when they would they would stop at dusk, they would eat, they would talk, they would discuss theology and natural history. And then they would sleep. Well, even though they were doing that, it seems that Farragut wasn't getting a good night's sleep. Well, Roland, being a chivalrous and polite knight, found a rock that was just the right size and shape to fit below Farragut's head. In gratitude, the relatively low wisdom, high intelligence character then informed Roland that of his weak spot at his navel. So, what I did was I said, okay, first of all, he's a highly trained fighter. So start with a hill giant. He's hill giant size. That's 5th edition hill giant. 4th and Pathfinder were about 2/3 his size. Anyway, so start with those stats. Now he'll be stronger and tougher. Maybe not more agile, so his strength and con went up. He's much more intelligent. The intelligence went from a 6 to a 10. He can hold a conversation. His wisdom stayed the same. He's still a bit of a fool. His charisma went up a little bit so that he could be at least attempt to be a commander besides just going, "Go now!" And then I gave him 7 levels of fighter with the Battlemaster path, which gave him 5 techniques and 5 maneuver dice. This makes him a very tough and crafty opponent. The end result is he was definitely no longer the same CR as what the standard hill giant is. So I went and looked to see what was closer to his hit points, attack and damage, armor class, and so on, your basic things, and realized that he was now roughly CR 11. So he is a CR 11 giant. He is really tough, really strong. He has resistance to all forms of melee attack, bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. Not even magic weapons, ignore it. However, a called shot to his belly does, with piercing attacks only. And it's possible that if you are fighting him, and you haven't done any kind of research, don't know anything, you can make a perception check and notice that out of any kind of piercing attack, about 1 out of 3 seems to do full damage to him. And then you notice that 1 out of 3 happens to be hitting him in the belly. It's got to be a piercing attack that could theoretically hit his belly, like a spear or an arrow. Not a rapier, not a short sword. And that's when you say, "Hey guys, poke him in the belly. Get in his belly." And so, as a team, you gang up on him and start doing full damage. So, in general, I started with the closest giant stats to the type of figure that he was, like in this case, hill giant, and then started tweaking. In the case of Argus, I started with a storm giant. I removed some storm giant abilities and added on others, including blind sight. When you got that many daggum eyes, you can see under any condition. And usually they ended up as a higher CR than the quote-unquote parent giant race, because these are unique characters. In some cases, like Polyphemus, ended up not only a higher CR, but physically larger. It never says how big Cyclops are, but their stats are lower than those of a hill giant, so they're probably on the average smaller than a hill giant. Polyphemus is larger, partly because he does have a semi-divine origin, and partly just because when I was first sculpting him, I misdid the scale. So I'm just, okay, he's just really big. Okay. Got the brass on his helmet done. And his boots should be about dry, and they are. So what we're going to do with the boots now is we're going to go ahead and give them boots a wash. I'm going to use the strong tone. There are 3 tones that came with the paint set that I got of wash. There is dark tone, which is kind of in between Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, if you're familiar with those. Strong tone, which pretty much is Agrax Earthshade for all intents and purposes. Slightly different, it's slightly yellower, not as reddish. And soft tone, which, you know, I'm actually gonna go ahead and I think I do want that redder tone. So I'm actually going to use Agrax Earthshade. Now, set this here, and I'm going to use a larger brush. Let's see what's a good, nice size larger brush. Let's use this one. And I'm going to use this. I'm going to get the brush just a bit wet and wipe it off. That just, you know, dampens the bristles. Put it in, and then just start brushing it over the boots. You want to make sure that you're covering the whole surface, but not very heavily, because what ends up happening is you end up getting coffee stain rings. You know, like when you put a coffee cup on a piece of paper, you have that little ring-shaped stain from where the bottom of the cup was in contact with the paper. You get something similar around the top of the grooves and divots and that. While it is still damp, you then go back in and you paint over a little bit heavier, paint over things like wrinkles, ridges between layers, and that kind of thing. Any place that there would be a darker shade. Okay. I've seen too many people who will paint the whole figure with just their base coat and then just slop Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade or some other wash over top and say, "Okay, done." That might be good for tabletop, you know, for your army, for a war game. But for your PC and the tabletop and D&D, that's kind of insulting them. You really want to learn how to do a little bit better than that. Do more than that. You know, give it a nice shade. Give it a highlights. And if you can do it, get textures. Okay. There we go. That's a bit better. Okay. And then, like I said, a little bit more over where the wrinkles are. And then wipe it and just kind of pull off some of the higher points, because you don't really need them there. Try to blend in as much as possible. And then let it dry. I actually have a mix of paints. One of the first things I got when I just got back into painting. I painted from about 84 to 2003. Painted about 19 years. And then stopped. And then earlier this year, about the same time I got the, I started doing the show, I decided let's get back into it. So I bought the Army Painter set. Army Painter, it comes with 50 bottles, of which 39 are basic paints. About 8 are washes, and 2 are special effects, like a dried rust color. It actually builds up a texture, and a slimy, shiny, glistening blood. And then over the course of the next several months, I started adding in other paints that I got from my local hobby shop. Usually Vallejo Game Color, or just, the straight up Vallejo brands, like your basic model color. Anyway, point being, I now have very close to 100 paints. Some of them are pretty unique. These down, I got some down here. This one is a glaze medium. It's similar to the matte medium, except it's explicitly intended to use as a glaze. It turns it completely translucent, so you put a thin layer over top to unify colors, or like if you painted it green and realized that you wanted it more blue, you could put the glaze medium and put some blue and shift it more in that direction. Gloss varnish. Crackle medium. What this does, let's say I wanted to have a muddy terrain. I take that crackle medium, a couple drops, mix it with a couple drops of reddish brown paint. Then when I paint it on the base, if I put a thin coat, it cracks up into small chunks. If I put a thick coat, it cracks up into large chunks. Okay. Now, and then I've got, like, this one is a translucent blue. Most blues are actually opaque, very opaque. This one's translucent. Most yellows and reds and oranges are translucent. This orange and this yellow are opaque. Okay. And yes, I also printed out the hangers. I designed and printed out the paint hangers. I've got these all sitting in. Hey. And I just got a Firefox update. Don't want a Firefox? No, I don't want a Firefox update yet. I'm going to get some soda. And we're waiting mostly on the ink to dry on the boots. I could go ahead. Yeah, let's go ahead and paint the blade of the sword while we're at it. The blade is going to start with this paint. It's actually another Vallejo, but it's aimed at airbrushing. So it's a little bit thinner, which for my purposes means I don't need to thin it down. Now I'm going to just drop a couple drops. And then I'm going to paint it on to the blade of the sword. This is actually a black metallic. And the end result is it looks very, very dark. This is a good thing because it means I can then dry brush metals, or if I don't dry brush, I can layer metals over it and still keep a shade and a metallic nature to it. So we're going here. I'm going to come over here. on this side of the hand. And make sure to go under the fingers. Now down the side, back side of the blade. Where it meets the cross guard. Okay, now I'm going to come back here, making sure that I've got everything at least black. And now we're going to do the underside of the blade. Now, note that, yes, I am tilting it and moving it and rearranging it, and yet it's still not affecting the puddles of ink because they've already settled. It's now just a sticky that I'm waiting on to dry. Yeah, it's 50 bottles. It cost, where I got it for $75. It was also on sale at the time. Now we'll come back to that here in just a minute. And anyway, it's running 94-ish on Amazon. That's not too bad. When you consider you're getting, your typical bottle of paint is $3 to $4, $5 to $6 if it's Games Workshop. That's not a bad deal even at the standard price. Okay. Still got some drip leaves left to dry on the brown. So we're going to move up to a dark iron. It's a gunmetal, they say, but it's a dark iron. Always shake your paint. Always shake your paint. So then we drop a drop there. It came out as more than a drop because it was slightly plugged. Oops. That's why I never just squeeze the paint. If it's not coming out, just hold it, release it, and get a nice little, get a pin or needle or something, poke in there, wiggle it out. So, we're now going to take this and we're going to paint everything except we're not going to paint the fuller. That's the groove on the blade. The reason is the fuller really needs to be distinct and sharp. We're also not going to bother with the back side of the blade, simply because it's much more, it's right up against the body, so it'll be shadow anyway. We'll do the same thing underneath. We're going to paint everything except, oops, I just noticed I didn't have the fuller underneath painted. I mean, it might never be seen except by me, but the fact is I'll still know. Now I'm painting these to what I would consider a high-end tabletop tier. This is not competition worthy. Competition worthy requires a whole lot more effort per paint and color, and it could take months for a figure to be competition worthy. Especially in this day and age. It used to be, when I was painting, that you were lucky if someone did more than... You were lucky if you knew about techniques other than washes and dry brushings. The idea of layering or two brush blending was just in somebody's eye at the time. In fact, one of the techniques that was used by a man named John Blanche, the man who helped define the look of Games Workshop, was he put the paint on the figure wet, and before it was dry, mixed the paint on the figure. Yeah, 2 BBs, make sure they're stainless steel BBs. I have some stainless steel hex nuts that I put in there. Okay. Now, slightly lighter shade of metal. And what I do with this, I'm going to go ahead and, once again, just a single drop, because I don't need the full drop. Bing. Little drop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the tip on this side, on the actual edge side, with this particular shade. And I come down to just below half. Just below halfway down. Then, on the flat side, I'm going to start down here and go to where the fingers are. And I'm going to reverse that when I paint the underside. So on the underside, I'm going to start down here with the edge, with the bevel. I'm going to come down about 2/3, maybe a little bit further past, and I'm going to kind of drift off. I'm going to start down at the actual peak on the flat of the blade, and I'm going to paint 2/3 of the way this way before I drift off. And it won't really be visible on the camera as much. Then comes the bright silver. You can hear my agitator. And once again, we're going to put a little drop it there. And what we're going to do is we're going to do just, like, say, the middle section here. And then the middle section here. We're going to reverse that and do just the middle section down here on the bevel. And then just the middle section on the flat near the tip. Now let's make sure to get this nice and opaque. Okay. Then what we're going to do, we're going to take this metal medium, and I'm going to put a full drop on top of where I put that silver. Gonna mix it up a little bit. not that brush, this brush. Mix it up a little bit. Just enough to tone it down from white. And then I'm going to come along the edge and paint the absolute edge. Now what I'm doing is I'm not using the tip of the brush, instead I'm using the side of the brush. And I'm going to make that, this basically is to try to show how sharp the blade is by making it shine more than the rest. Then we're going to take it and we're going to do a very light, following the divisor between the bevel and the flat of the blade. I'm not going to be doing this on the top, on the underside, simply because this is very clearly one side pointing up and one side pointing down. I'm also going to go ahead and do the edge here and a little bit down the back. There. So the blade of the sword is done. Anyway. It varies, actually. It also depends on what part of the mini. Case in point. About an hour and a half last night, I spent painting the flesh tones on Roland and, come on, where is it? Beowulf. Hour and a half on just the flesh tones. I finished the entirety of the rest of Beowulf this morning. So, if I'm painting to a tabletop standard, I would be painting 10 figures at the same time, an entire squad. So it would probably take me 4 to 6 hours to paint an entire unit of 10 figures. So less than an hour each. Almost less than half an hour each. Whereas if I'm painting to a display standard like these, you're looking at, several hours per figure, up to as much as 8 hours, especially for a large figure like this. And a lot of it on a large figure like this is waiting for paint to dry. Whereas if I was painting for competition, weeks per figure, and that's not counting doing the base. Okay. So the paint, the Agrax Earth shade is dry. We're going to go ahead and put down a layer, a bit of fur brown. And what this is going to be for, it's going to be dry brushing across the boot. Let's use this chisel brush. Get a bit on there and make sure there's no straight up dry parts left or wet parts left. We're going to be coming up this way because toes tend to wear out first, and so that we can hook the edges of this section that wraps around his ankle and calf without bringing it up over the edge of the knee. And we're going to go side to side over this top right here and over this section. Got to make sure to get it. Now we're going to do it over here. Okay. Now, it is 9:55. That's 2 hours in. And what I've managed to get done, I got the helmet finished. I got the elbows and this right knee that's poking out in a kind of a taupe. I've given a base coating on the tunic, and I've gotten the boots done. I'm probably going to come back over along this upper portion and make it a little bit lighter, like the inside of a folded over cuff boot. And then next thing that I will be doing is coming back in with a nice rich red on this tunic, and then working out from there. Okay. No. Good. There we go. Oh, look at this. Look at this one. Her nosy right there. Oh, she's... Uh-oh. What'd you do, baby? Yeah, going back to sleep. Going back to sleep. Oh. She wants to snuzzle first. And then jam her head against my hand. That's all I'm going to be doing for tonight. Tomorrow morning I will be probably finishing this guy up, so sometime tomorrow afternoon or evening I'll be posting a finished photograph. Now, the face was already done before tonight, and faces are the most important things on almost any miniature, because that's where people look first. They look at the face. They look to see, what does this guy look like? What does this girl look like? What does this thing look like? And in his case, I wanted to keep some of the brutality of the hill giant. Thus, there's a faint 5 o'clock shadow. But I also wanted to give him a bit more of a steady gaze than your typical hill giant. Now, I didn't want him to be a slack-jawed yokel. Of course, that also factors into the way I sculpted it. Anyway, next show is Sunday. I have 2 Patreons on Sunday. Yay! And I will also very likely have 2 Patreons next Sunday. Yay! So, here's hoping. And we should have some interesting little sculpts. And we'll find out exactly what one of them is tomorrow. But for now, that'll be it. Now, you'll notice, if you pay attention, I'm actually not broadcasting in 720. In 480, I'm broadcasting in 720. It doesn't really show. So anyway, yep, I am almost at 300 subs. This time last week, I was at 242. I was preparing myself for 250. And now, yep. Anyway. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and hold up my hand. And I'm going to count down to 1. And when I get to 1, I'm going to say something goofy and then log out and start cleaning up this tray table. Okay, so let's go. You can see the kitty clearly. And let's see what happens when I come over here. What you do? What you doing? What you doing? Anyway, count from 5 to 1. When I get to 1, I'm going to log out and say something stupid. Alright, so that's going to be 5. Well, let me refresh this page because, I want to make sure I'm not, dealing with, want to make sure I'm not dealing with a, lag. So that will be a 5, a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. Proximity to a cat causes intellect to devolve. Good night.